They danced at the birthday party. Come here. Yes. Yeah. You don't recognize her, Robin? You ain't say hi to her during her birthday party? They never do when they performing. Maybe they just into the. Maybe y'all don't. You gotta always remember your elders. Remember I was at a birthday party. Yeah, I was singing it back.
Might need to move this or another.
No, we got some more bodies coming, but we shifting it.
Yeah.
Shift and twist. Turn your monkey out.
Which way?
Twist.
Which way?
All
right.
Just go flat.
Okay.
I think they, and then I was talking to him, I just,
to kind of come and get their, to put their flowers on the offering sheet. This is before the libation. I assume this is the libation. Is that what you said that's going to be? Oh,
Yes, sir.
but the floor is going to be where? The
What's up, Ma?
It's going to be
It
right.
don't have to be over here. There's a tree. What's with this generator?
I knew it was going to be empty.
On the elder. You know, you got
No, you got to come with like half a dozen. Where are these people in the power?
What's that?
All right, I tell you what. This here, y'all got me feeling some type of way. Morning. Huh? No, because generator's not here. Program starts in 15 minutes. This camera's got to go on there. This was going to be set up and turned on. Do we have to move any other tables? Those far ones got to come in a little bit. Good morning, sir. I see a gentleman with muscles. How you doing?
Deborah, you met
I never did.
Come on in. Make sure I try to get his presentation. Good morning. Good morning. No, ma'am. Thank you.
It's 9:04 right now.
Excuse me.
Gonna watch the roads and live on the line for daily. Gonna watch the roads and for daily. For daily. For daily.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It is really good to see you. It has been 2 years since we had a chance to look each other in the eye. And it is certainly a welcome sight. As you know, we have met here for 25 years. So this is a very special time for us. It's a special time because we come to commemorate the elders. But it's also a special time because we now can see each other face to face and get a chance to dance, sing, and be happy. Today, we have our guest speaker, who is Donald West, and many of you know Donald, but for those who have not met Donald, let me tell you a little bit about Donald West. He is an instructor and coordinator in the Department of History, Humanities, and Languages at Trident Technical College. He teaches U.S. history, African history, and African American history. West is an active member in archival management and museum education, the work he did for 13 years prior to joining Trident. He's also an avid traveler. He's a travel enthusiast, as well as an active member of the International Education Program at Trident Technical College. He has traveled to Cameroon, Ghana, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Gambia, where he has visited important historic sites, including places connected to the Atlantic slave trade. Please welcome Donald West.
Thank you, Regina. I don't have a mic. I'm gonna project, try to project. If I'm not, just wave at me and let me know. This subject is a big subject, and my presentation will be an introduction and a brief overview. This is something that when we talk about it historically, we're talking about something that takes place, at least in terms of documenting the Atlantic slave trade, for more than 400 years. And the best that we could do is we have things in your program, if you had a chance to get that. We have readings. I hope you take advantage of the readings. And it's just a small sample. Most African countries have done their own work. And they've also done, notice, most of these are books, but they've done articles too. And I've had the pleasure of being able to travel to some of these places, to learn and study. And I'm going to share that with you as well. I chose this title for a specific reason. As we continue through the presentation, I'm going to point out some things, but I acknowledge that some people don't like that word. And this is an opportunity to kind of provoke a dialogue and discussion. And I'll also share why. This is part of what inspired me for this discussion, because often in my own classes, I would talk about the Columbian exchange. When Columbus arrived in the Western Hemisphere, thereafter, the whole world is changed by this contact. And as a result of it, oftentimes we talk about the plants and the animals and the people, but we don't talk about this. And we should, and I just gently remind my students, and what about the Atlantic slave trade? It's important to talk about because it is the largest forced migration in the history of the world, even to this day. Millions of people on the continent are caught up in it. Millions die, and millions are transported. So it should be part of the Columbian discussion. The dates, they vary. What takes place before the 16th century are individuals who end up in places around the Mediterranean region. Some on islands, some as gifts. We know even to Vatican City. Some are in places like the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, and Spain. Black folks end up as far into Europe, as far north as Moscow. But it's a trip, it's is a dribble in terms of the numbers. But then the numbers begin to increase. And these numbers are significant because this is also debate. I've been to presentations where people have used numbers up into the 20s and even more. What is this, in fact? This is part of an effort that's been on for more than almost 2 decades, and it's part of what is a database. But I understand that we're not committed to those numbers. Numbers can be used in many different ways. I feel strongly about the numbers between 10 and 15 million. But I'm going to also share with you why I think these numbers are often debated in just a few. There have been a lot of documentation. Why? Because this became the great first super global business. You have a lot involved in this. You have ships, you have personnel, you have politicians, you have investments. Different folks are into this because there's money. And the term used at the time in describing the Atlantic slave trade was black gold. And we use that term now for a lot. Yeah, and we know how it impacts our lives now. Like today, how much it costs to get here. Okay? So this is the same thing that's happening. I'm going to ignore this one now, but come back to it. I'm bringing this up now because I noticed that at some presentations, people have started using this terminology, and they use it, but they don't talk about it. And oftentimes, when I was talking to a person about these numbers, I said, well, I think this is part of the explanation. They're combining the African slave trade story with the Atlantic slave trade story. And this is significant because this is something that takes place before the Atlantic slave trade. A trickle that is going through North Africa, a number of people who are then swept up in East Africa and end up as part of the Indian Ocean travel. And we don't know those numbers. We are not sure about those numbers, but we at least need to know that this might be also part of this story. And I would argue to you, we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade. We're talking about the middle passage of the Atlantic slave trade today. But we should never forget this part of the story, even if we're not always sure of the numbers, because this was part of the African story. And what does it mean? Well, I think certainly appropriate, but then also let's talk about that. And the involvement of the Arab Islamic traders. Again, the numbers are, at least we see early on, and we're not sure of those numbers. How do we document those numbers? Maybe they should be higher, but they should be part of the discussion. Because a lot less exists. This is something that's going on and continues. It's not until truly after the Great War, or the First World War, with the founding of the League of Nations, that they say, hey, well, we got to come together and put a stop to this. But we know that even beyond the post-war years, First World War, Great War, activity continues. And just like in the case of the Atlantic slave trade, there's a lot happening on the continent. in terms of activity and violence and death. And we equate those numbers into. All three monotheistic religious groups are part of this story. They all are part of the business, the discussion, and even the debate. And I often tell people, I equate this to like a drug war, what is happening in terms of the Atlantic slave trade. As the behavior, the violence, and the great deal of impact and harm done is very widespread. But for the purpose of discussing the Atlantic slave trade, we have to look at what is happening after Columbus arrives in the Western Hemisphere. He goes back, they make an effort to convert some of the Indian population, but it doesn't work out well, and they soon after begin to suffer from the results of the exchange of diseases. And Europe is debating the humanity of the Indian population. Because if maybe they're not human enough, maybe who cares at how they're treated? And this person, who was a conquistador at one point, then he became a priest, argues for their humanity. And I often tell people, when you're talking about business, you have to use a business language. You can't tell people to stop making money without coming up with an alternative plan. That's where we are. And this alternative plan is stop mistreating the Indian people, but let's get laborers from the continent of Africa. They're farmers, they're not Christians, so maybe their humanity can compare, and besides, they're used to doing the work, because there's going to be some mining done, there'll be enough mining done that we still see the name used today. There are hundreds of thousands of millions of people with the last name Silver, because they were part of that legacy of silver mining. But the real value of the Western Hemisphere will be in the land. The very fertile land that could grow those things that were in Asia, that people tried to get. Some of those things in Africa that people tried to get. And some of those things where you can make a whole lot of money. And so I often tell people it's not really a triangular trade. This includes Asia. There are a lot of different things happening all over the world. And that can't happen without large numbers of population or people or labor to do that work. And it will be. Vessels are designed differently. Insurance policies are established for this kind of operation, just like they do now. Anyone in business now, if you got a business, you have a particular type of insurance, that's what happens then. And the relationship includes the Europeans who are on the coastal area. They're not really running around and grabbing up people. They're hiring people to grab up people. And this starts almost from the very beginning. Enslaving people is not new, and the use of them for purpose of labor and other reasons exists. And so the results of it will have people who are able to set up an operation and then receive the captives. In exchange, they get a lot of different things. Some gold, some silver, but a lot of different things, including iron bars and rum. Later, also guns. Not at first, but later. And this is one of the earliest illustrations of this example. As farmers and artisans stop doing what they're doing, just as, think about it, in the drug trade, we hear these tragic stories all the time of students who had good grades and get involved in drugs, athletes who were brilliant who get involved in drugs, church folks, we don't want to admit it, singing in the choir and get involved in drugs. This is what happens. The farmers and artisans, you know, that's not the kind of glamorous work anybody likes to brag about. And the next generation want to get as far away from that hard work as possible. Both of my parents were on a farm. I did construction work, and my father didn't want me to do construction work. And so they become graders because you can make more money by capturing and kidnapping people. But I want to be clear about this because I hear it all the time. I hear it now, and every year since I became interested in this, I still hear people who say Africans sold their own people. And that's misleading and incorrect. There are large numbers of very diverse groups in Africa. It is the most diverse in terms of the ethnic groups, the languages, the customs, the beliefs and practices. And what they're doing now is where they may have confronted each other in trade, they're now confronting each other to extract from, to capture and kidnap. And we don't say that of Europeans. We don't say the Europeans killed their own people. Do we? I don't think so. Because we know how bad World War II was. And we don't say the Germans and the French are the same people. Do we? Okay. So please just be mindful that Africa is not a country and it's not one people. I've been to a lot of these places. Thank goodness I've had the opportunity of taking some others with me. And I have too many photographs to show. So I just wanted to show them all together. And this one is also a very good lead-in. Notice the name, Elmina. It was a mining operation at first to get gold from that region. And it's one of the oldest non-European structures built off of the continent of Europe, built in the 1480s. And it could hold as many as 1,500 people at one time. When I was doing something for the very outstanding work of the slave dwelling project a few years ago, I made mention, this is the largest of any holding of slave personnel population. It's well preserved. A very nice tour takes place all the time. They have very well trained docents. And I've had this opportunity of going into different areas, including the sub areas. Gory Island, on that island, which is residential. It is believed that some of people came through this area. Another shot of Elmina. I always ask people to share with me their own thoughts. I carry a diary. And it's a very emotional experience. When we went from Elmina, had lunch, and then went to the Cape Coast, some people didn't even want to get off of the bus and go with it. It was that emotional. We had that much of it. Some didn't eat lunch. But many of these sites are now just being overtaken by the natural growth around it, including Bundside. Some of you have been there. This place in Cameroon that very few people visit. And they've done some archaeological work in both places. Fort James, which is slowly being taken over by the rising water levels. It's now named Kuchipinte Island for the subject that we're all familiar with. And the numbers and where people came from. A small number came out of this area, but even a much smaller number ended up in North America, that will be Canada and the United States. Between 4 but less than 5% of the total number. But when it ended, the activity continued. And that could be also part of the subject of the discussion in terms of these numbers. For the first 200 years, the vast majority were males, as opposed with the Arab Islamic trade, the vast majority were females. And when I visited this site, I remember someone at the U.S. Embassy saying, "Oh, well, they got it wrong. They're talking about something that happened in the 1840s, but the slave trade had ended with the United States agreeing to end it in 1808." And then I quietly, when we met that evening, explained to the group, but they don't realize that the illegal activity continued for a long time. And it continued, for the most part, as long as slavery continued. So in Brazil, there was still activity, and there was still this kind of activity going on the continent of Africa. And so I was able to visit 2 places connected to that. And visit a place where some of that activity included the rivers, which made me also understand when we're talking about the penetration of this as far inward of maybe 1,000 miles, maybe it was possible because some are traveling by way of river to the coast. And in this area, a person connected to South Carolina, he had operations in Georgia, but he was also someone connected to South Carolina, Styles, and his African wife continued that activity for a long time. I'm only mentioning Styles lightly because he was one of the few people who was actually caught, jailed, and convicted for his illegal behavior. Most of the time that just didn't happen. And maybe one of these days I'll get to that area in East Africa. But I, again, want to emphasize this is a lot of people, a lot of different people. And I only mention a sample of these individuals from as far up as what would be Mauritania, as far south as what would be Angola. Sometimes the word Angola and Congo are used interchangeably. And that was a large number from that area. And these are some of the ethnic groups: Linga, Gula, Ibu, Yoruba, Walla, Bemeleki, and Nango Tip, Mindi and Tini. See, these are names we're familiar with in this area. Sarah, Kru, Fulani, Mandinka, Fang, Baga. And the Baga we're also familiar with. They were very successful at the few years ago saying, well, you know, African Americans, we got it just so well here, and we can even thank the, and he put it, folks who came from Africa. That's the way he put it. Folks who came from Africa. As though it's a Ellis Island story. People aren't showing up on the coast of Africa with tickets in their hand. That's not this story. These are folks, I can't imagine, you sometimes hear this in some of these crime stories. You remember Elizabeth Smart talking about her experience. You can't imagine that someone would grab you up and then you would be in a place for up to maybe 6 months or a year. Then they would put you on board a vessel and it would be travel that would be anywhere from 38 days to 2 months. And you don't have TV. You don't have radio. They're not giving news reports. You aren't going to the cafe on the vessel like a cruise. You're laying in waste and dying people. You're hearing sounds that keep you from sleeping. And then you make it to the other side where they fatten you up and season you. Maybe they gotta do some whipping to get you in line. And then you work. And as much as we know about slavery, the years like the 16th and 17th century, we still know a lot less about that because a great many of those people are just simply worked to death and buried, and you just keep recycling them by going to the continent of Africa. And this is one of those examples in which if people aren't able to survive, you can write them off as an insurance loss. And some even have talked about various fish and sharks that follow these vessels. And this is one of those stories. And so when we're talking about the Middle Passage, we're not talking about something in which people are expecting to arrive, expecting to go to work. Maybe they'll live in a bad neighborhood or a poor neighborhood, and maybe they'll have soup for dinner. These are people who have no idea what is happening to them and why. And the suffering they have to endure. Most of us can't go a day. We really can't without an aspirin, maybe a little more. Think about that. Most of us here, we have 3 meals a day and maybe too much dessert. And this is not that story. This had to be horrible. And we do have some oral stories that tell us about that. And we believe that anywhere from 1.6 to 2 million who survived the travel for wherever they came from on the continent to the coast and been in the castles or the places where they were held for a time, then made it onto the vessels but did not make it to the other side of the Atlantic. And the reason that we are so interested in it here, and I tell people that all the time, the people of the Low Country are maybe more in tune to their Africanism than any place in the United States, because we've done hard work to find out where we came from on the continent. And I share that on the other side when I get a chance to talk to folks. And this low country story, of course, is shared by others elsewhere. I had a chance, I hope I get an opportunity maybe to do a little more, but I had a chance to visit several of the museums in Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea, and Ghana. And we talked. And I still communicate with some of the people. And the beautiful Black Civilizations Museum in Senegal is now open. And we had a chance to go this time. And they always have an American story in these museums. They like appealing to this country because they know of the great interest in this country. Even if it was a small percentage that ended up in North America, I remind people the reason we're interested in this story in America is because on the eve of the American Civil War, the United States was the wealthiest modern slave nation in the world. So much great wealth had been created by the enslaved. It was combined to the insurance companies and the manufacturing and even the banking. That's why we're interested in this story, because we know it created great wealth, like rice, indigo, tobacco, corn, and cotton. And I've gotten a chance to visit some of these places. So that 5% makes a big impact. And that's my purpose of wanting to talk about why we are talking about a forced migration. It's not about offending anyone. It's about informing and educating someone. That we're not talking about the same thing if we're talking about the European experience, which deserves the attention and respect that we've given it academically. This deserves the same amount of respect. And in the Low Country, we can see how much this is still part of the lives of the people of the Low Country. And I remind people this too. When we're talking about the Low Country and the Gullah Geechee, and we're talking about the African experience and the African legacy, that is the Southern experience. So sometimes it's almost like whites accept and embrace the idea of being Southerners, but that black folks are what? They're Southerners too, and have been in the South in some form or another for a very long time. And we can see all of that in many ways still in this country. One other point I wanted to make, and then I'm finished, and allow for the Q&R. And that is, there was always great resistance. I think that is also an important part of the story. A tremendous amount of fighting on the continent of Africa. And so even after the slave trade had ended, east or west or central, these groups harbor some very different feelings about now being colonized and put together. That's one of the problems and one of the struggles now, because they had fought so against certain things. And this is one of those groups that I've studied. A few years ago, I met a young lady who was Crew, but I've lost contact with her. I still have her on my emails. I hope I can one day see her again, because I had invited her to come to the Low Country. We were at a conference, but we're not familiar with this group. The former president of Liberia, Charleston, is Crew. And you'll find them in Ghana, Ivory Coast and Liberia mostly. And so when the Americans went to Liberia and wanted to do those good things, including converting people, these folks were very much, as they had resisted the slave trade, resisted that nonsense too. Excuse me if I use that word, because like most of you, I know we all, a great many of us, have great respect for religion, so do I. But we can see at times how it was used for the wrong way. And I'm going to conclude by, because I don't know if I'll get a chance to do that later, and allow for the Q&R now, yes? But I wanted to conclude by acknowledging someone who often gets forgotten these days. I was reading something just the other day, and it was talking about how a group was going in '94 from the College of Charleston and establishing, they didn't mention any of the names. And I remember the work they had done in December of '89. I worked at the Avery, and my boss, Dr. Myrtle Glasgow, was going. And she was the one that told me, she said, well, we need to take pictures and document everything that's current. And so I did. And she was going on to Africa about the camera. And I said, well, boss, you got to go with the camera because you don't want to rely on other people sharing their photos with you. Because I had experienced that at the Navy, where we would ask for things and there were folks, including news outlets, wouldn't share. And then they would ask to use our photos. Yeah. You don't know what I'm talking about. And so I wanted to acknowledge Muhammad Al-Fawad because this guy really got a lot of people thinking. And a whole lot of other folks have come along. And no criticism of them. But I hope that we remember him for his efforts. This is us having dinner together in Sierra Leone, and the group that I took. So I just wanted to acknowledge him when we talk about our instances today. Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any questions? I'm open. Actually, questions. Well, I only wanted to give people who have questions first, and then if we have time, yes, sir.
Tell me why they call it the middle passage.
Why?
They call it the middle passage.
I remember that term being used for the first time, and basically it was that part of what inspired me about the whole forced migration. That we were always talking about Africans arriving and the numbers, but we were talking about the activity of raiding and war and all the rest. And so scholars began talking about this period on board vessels, but they weren't really describing what was happening on board vessels. The one book that I put in our readings, Slavery at Sea, because we have young people among us, I'll just say to you, that's a very adult reading. And so the middle passage became part of this overall story of the Atlantic slave trade. What these vessels were, that was that part of the story, on board these vessels and where they took people. But we often didn't describe what was happening on these vessels. And when I meant that it was a very adult reading, all I can say is that I challenge you to get the book. It's worth having as part of your library. But it's not a celebration at all. It's horrifying, the story is told. And that many of the young people in particular, young Europeans, it just as sometimes people do when we're describing drugs in this country. They think they're going to make a little bit of money and maybe put up something, have a small piece of property. And they were just as vulnerable to these various diseases. Did that answer your question? Yes. Okay. Yes, please. Oh, okay. I saw her first and then you.
Would you describe, most people probably already know that Africa is a continent and it has many countries with many cultures and many things. Young people just think of Africa.
Yeah, it's not most of these countries, it's not a hard vocabulary to know, but we have to condition people to think that way. That, we can say Egypt, but most of these names are familiar to us. It's not a lot of work, and I realize that this is a lot of work, but we are up to the challenge. You get it all the time. I'm going to Africa. I know that's the easiest way to describe it. And I tell people this is a very big place. Some of us have traveled by way of road in our own country. This place would take up the entire side of the United States 3 times. And then there would be something still left over. So you're talking about a very large place. And we just need to remind people that. Only because there's a lot of confusion when you think about Africa as a country and one people. I had that experience for myself. I wanted to take folks a few years ago, and then there was war in Libya, and they said, well, don't go. They didn't tell me don't go. They said, you're not going because it's dangerous. And I was telling them, well, Libya is a long way. Here it is right there. It's a long way from where I was going, which is over here. and when there is corruption, and I was sitting on a ferry with someone crossing the Gambia River just a few months ago, less than 2 months ago, and we were sitting and talking, and we were talking about corruption. I told him, I said, well, we have corruption in our country too. We just don't pay attention if it's not $1 billion in this country. And I trust you really do believe that if there's corruption everywhere in the world, that there's corruption here too. I hope you believe that. So yes, it takes a little work, but it's worth the effort. Because we are used to doing hard work. So let's do hard work in understanding Africa too. Yes? Let's see. Is it in your program?
Didn't hear
Yes,
the
it is.
question. Didn't hear the question.
He wanted to know the book that I was speaking of, Slavery at Sea. Yes. And it's in the program. It's also in the reading list. But I was reading that one, and I knew what to expect, but then it was just a lot of nasty detail that I thought, see, that's the part of where there's a real separation of this whole Ellis Island story. When you're talking about the behavior towards black women on these ships. Yes, I saw it, Dan. Yes.
I guess it's a short question. So the first part is, can you tell a bit more about how certain people
Well, let me cover that second part in a few. Yes, and some of these places are talked about. Traditional Africa, men do certain work, women do certain work. So you have, especially in this area of West Africa.
Excuse me, Donald, could you repeat the question?
She was asking if people were targeted and what specific areas, correct?
Oh, no, so people were targeted for, and I want to know how that correlates to how we have different black homes in the United States.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if I can answer that all together because it's going, but that's what I meant. And what one of the experiences for us that we experienced a long time in the United States in particular is that these different people are drawn together by one struggle of freedom. We think of black folks as being the same here in the United States, but based on our experiences and background, they can be very different. And the further we are removed from that period where we were enslaved, and other things that happen in our lives, the less we know and the less we agree. But we can see some of the diversity in Africa. And it did not all go away. It didn't die. The diversity in terms of the skill set, the diversity in terms of our physical features, and the diversity in terms of language. And all of that didn't go away. Some of these groups, the Fula, are known as cattle herders. And they were the first cowboys in this country. And so that's what they brought with them. The Baga, Mindi, and Timni are all rice growers. The Igbo are a classless society. And it was very difficult for colonization because they couldn't just pick up chief and beat him into submission and then he would get the rest of the group together. In the early 1800s, Igbo who arrived in the area near Beaufort, a large number of them committed suicide. Then they accept enslavement. And there were some groups where it was feared that they wouldn't make very good slaves. And we can talk about that. And another thing that we can talk about is West Africa is not only diverse in terms of the things that I just talked about, but they're matrilineage societies. And that makes black women a very different class of people than the European women that they would be encountered with. Because they were used to centuries of leadership, centuries of being respected in their communities. And they determined things like property inheritance, like they can. So is that helping?
Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I saw your hand.
Thank you, Professor West.
That's my colleague from the agency. I often refer to Millicent, I refer to it as the first four. The first four. Meaning it was you, me, Myrtle, and who was it? No. What is her name?
I said, I'll say Alpha.
No. Who was the secretary for us? Last name was Butt. She moved away. Yeah, right. Felicia. We were the first four. All right.
I just want to say thank you for the many years you've been educating us. You've been doing it so long, and I want your perspective on something. With not only the diversity of the continent of Africa, there's this whole understanding
I think it's easier for people to be educated about Africa and that diversity now. I start off one of my courses. I talk about the fact that in the 1800s, you had some black folks who were doing things like that, including George Washington Reed, who was a Civil War veteran and the first African American scholar or historian. He was talking about things like that. And I'm glad that I have his book as part of my own collection. But one of the interesting turning points came when there was this one guy who was at Harvard, and he even suggested that in the early 1900s. And his department met with him, and he was thrown out of the university. You know, he was just told, what kind of learning have you been teaching our kids? And I'm just sharing with you my own experience. I remember saying that in junior high, and I couldn't even get all the words out. Before I was drowned out by people who were saying things like, what you claiming Africa for, and all of the rest of it, and these people don't like you anyway, and I still have to explain that to people, and where did you get that from in terms of the meeting? I think, like I said, this group, meaning the Low Country, we embrace that people. And it's so important that we don't wait on the schools to educate us about that. You got enough out there now, I'm telling you. You got libraries, you got the internet where you can go in and order these books, and some of you got some money. No, this is what I'm saying. Some of you got some money, and so some of you are going to these places. That's what Dorothy and I were talking about just before you all arrived, because it's just been my pleasure. When I first went, I came back with two things I wanted to do. I wanted to continue learning and in fact, bring people from the continent. See, all of that is happening. You're talking about an exchange in terms of both ways. Very little happened before the First World War. And now you can go, and I hope you get a chance to go to these places. There are a lot of places to go. I like going to different places, but the last 3 times I've gone to Senegal and the Gambia, and I like doing that because I know the people there. And there's a lot to see and learn. And so all of that is part of it. I think the perspective is that people are changing in that they also recognize that this makes much more, it makes a lot more sense than what they used to hear and what they see on TV and still see on TV. But sometimes you still see some things that need explaining, but they don't get explained. Yes. And then one more.
Any drummers meetings after morning? May I have all the drummers please to come forward? We're gonna actually get ready.
All right. Yes, please.
Yes, I was, you had mentioned that we had, okay, targeted certain areas in Africa because of their skills. Can you help us understand which skills that, and which countries they targeted, and how it built America to its greatness?
Okay. In this area of Central Africa, you have the Congo, and one other point I'd like to bring out to you. Some would rationalize, well, these folks were Christians, but one of the largest areas of extracting Africans from the continent was an area where Christianity had gained a foothold. So when we think that none of the people who arrived were Christians, they were. And so the Congo area here, Cameroon is a country that is, the space known as Cameroon is a little larger than California, but it had a very small population. Nevertheless, 3% came from there. The Guinea coast, the Windward coast, and the Grain coast. Oftentimes we talk about this is Sierra Leone, this is Guinea, this is Liberia. We often talk about that, especially among Gullah Geechee here, because the vocabulary is still part of that experience. But there were more people from the Senegambia region who arrived in Sierra Leone and Guinea. This large area is Angola, and you can see at the mouth of the Congo is a small area. That's why those terms are used interchangeably in some cases. Sometimes people say Congo, and they may mean an overlapping area, because these are the modern borders of the continent. This is not Sierra Leone, in terms of the region, was part of what was described as the Senegambia area. Did that help?
Yeah, what did you pointed out where they came from, but what skills did they bring?
Oh, that's
to
right.
America?
Well, that's why I was sharing this part of it with you. Is that these aren't just laborers who maybe the level of intelligence might be debated. Most of the time, historians often describe these folks are the young, the fit, they are intellectually more advanced. Just like we do now, our young people. They know things didn't exist for us. I tell them that when I was in school, I went to a place that had one TV station, and it cut off at 1 o'clock in the morning. It went a little longer on Friday, where you could be scared to go to sleep. You remember those really very bad horror movies. But this population are targeted as, when we're describing people as maybe adults, we're probably describing a large number of these people as teenagers. And like I said, some of us, we walk a little slower now. We're not being fixed. These are physically athletic people. These are healthy people. And these are people who are grasping things like they do now. I love going to Africa and introducing people who either they have a formal education or not, but they speak 4 and 5 different languages, because that was business to do. You need to communicate with people to have a good business plan for yourself. And that's the kind of intellect they had. And it happens that these are the targeted folks. Imagine what quality of life for all of us, we'll just say over 35, okay? All of us over 35, if one person in our community went away, disappeared every single day. Imagine the impact of the quality of our lives. And so now you have dozens of people, hundreds of people, and thousands of people being attacked targeted. They were fit. They were ready to assume those important roles as adults. And the growth of the population depended on, just like it does now, those people. Yes, sir. And then, what? Oh, that's great. Yes, sir. So did I answer your question? Thank you.
My question is, what is the, just like we're studying the history, what is the status on the continent of, because they went through colonial being colonized, what is the effort on the university levels of the understanding of their history on the continent within their youth, in their universities, of them getting their history of their great empires before that? Because I'm sure colonization had an effect on that in education. What is the status on that in their university as far as teaching that education?
It varies, but I would say where I've been, the universities, they are often, they're a small price, so they get the intellectuals they want. They do the reading, they do the studies. I've even gone into the library, and I was saying most of us go to the library to use the internet these days. Sorry, I didn't mean to offend anybody. But these are people who use books. They're using books and articles. I like going to Senegal and the Gambia because I know the people there, and we go throughout the campus of both the Oak University in Dakar and the Gambia University. You see the same intelligence, a lot of respect for learning, the hard work of using written materials, which are available. That translates very well into the community. And with, like, especially for both countries I mentioned, they do a lot of good work at the elementary school level. It was so much fun traveling to Goree Island and seeing children who were gone. And they serenaded us. They started singing, and we joined in singing. And they go to these museums. When I went to the Black Civilization Museum, there were 2 busloads who came in, and they had a special class, and they didn't mind me just standing around listening. So they are taking advantage of the formal education of also being exposed to their history in a way that will translate into them having respect for their past, being critical of things, and that creates its own danger. But learning to use those skills in the neighborhood and elsewhere. Our guy was talking about languages, and you would say, see, we don't learn Fulani, we grow up with it. We don't learn Mendiga and Walla Fujala, we grow up with it. And then, so you have children who are mixed together of these different ethnic groups, very young, already learning these other languages. Our bus driver, he did not have a formal education. But we needed him because he could speak Fulani and French. And our guide could speak Walla and Mendiga. And he could speak Walla. So you give that kind of appreciation, I believe, fairly on, I did go to a university where they were teaching the applied sciences, like at Trident Tech. And I tell people, some of the folks in Trident Tech, they are being taught now, and they're going out to jobs that are $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 now. And if you want to talk to me about it afterwards, I'm available. I shake my head at that. But I took a group in 2018, and a former student went, and she got her son to go. He was in Jacksonville doing work on a ship. He made money to the degree he paid for his mother's trip. See, wouldn't that be nice? That you all honor mom on Mother's Day with a trip to Africa? Honor dad on a day of Father's Day with a trip to Africa. And we kind of joked about it because she could be borrowing money from me while she was there. So, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, you did.
One more question. Oh, no. No more questions. The point of any presentation should be, I'm going to learn more, I'm going to read more. I hope you will. Because this, like I said, this is a serious enough issue that we should have the same respect when we're talking about the people who left Europe for the reasons they left Europe and arrived in the United States. But it's not the Ellis Island story. And that we need to talk about. Thank you.
I'm just doing research away from the property.
You just given out. No, they used today. No, I overlooked the fact that they have commitments. She has gymnastics and they karate. So I completely forgot about that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gina. I'm sorry. Well, that's
studied at it too. Yes, sir.